He was a powerful millionaire, but a poor girl who sold water touched his heart. Before the story begins, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. Lucas Hayes wasn't a man who usually paid attention to the small details of life. As a powerful millionaire and CEO of a thriving investment firm, his days were filled with boardroom meetings, stock fluctuations, and high-stakes decisions. His world revolved around numbers and power, a reality where emotions and spontaneity had no place. But that day, as his sleek black Aston Martin rolled down the bustling streets of New York City, something, or rather someone, made him pause. It was an unusually hot afternoon, and the sidewalks were overflowing with people weaving through the chaos of city life. The impatient honks of taxi drivers filled the air, the scent of street food mingled with the crisp scent of summer, and pedestrians rushed past each other, lost in their own worlds. Yet, amidst the crowd, there she was, a young woman standing at the corner of an intersection, her arms raised high as she called out with unwavering enthusiasm, "Ice-cold water! Just $2!" Her voice rang out, unbothered by the indifference of passers-by who barely spared her a glance. Her confidence stood in sharp contrast to her worn-out appearance. Her faded jeans had seen better days, her oversized t-shirt was slightly wrinkled, and her sneakers were scuffed. But there was something about her, something striking. Lucas, always in control, always with a plan, found himself doing something uncharacteristic. He slowed down. He watched as she handled her little business with a tenacity that should have been reserved for Wall Street brokers. Her dark hair was tied up in a messy bun, loose strands sticking to her forehead from the heat. But it wasn't her appearance that held his attention. It was the fire in her eyes. As he watched, a man in a crisp, white button-down shirt stopped in front of her. "Give me a water," he muttered, grabbing a bottle without looking up. She handed it over with the same enthusiasm, her voice unwavering. $2, ice cold, straight from my cooler." The man took a gulp, then scoffed. $2? Are you kidding me? This costs half that at the store. Are you trying to rip people off? Lucas expected her to back down, to apologize, to look away in discomfort. But instead, her eyes blazed with defiance. "Rip you off?" she echoed, stepping forward. "I walked up and down the street 3 times to buy this water. I carried this heavy cooler on my shoulders, stood in the sun, and shouted like crazy. If you want it cheaper, go buy it at the store." A slow smirk tugged at Lucas's lips. He had met countless business people in his lifetime. Billionaires, CEOs, investors, the kind of men who claimed to be ruthless negotiators. Yet here she was, a street vendor, holding her ground like she owned the world. The man's face twisted in anger. "You're taking advantage of hardworking people," he spat. She didn't flinch. "Taking advantage? You already drank half of it. If you don't want to pay, spit the water back into the bottle and give it back to me." A few pedestrians who had overheard the exchange chuckled. The man blinked, clearly caught off guard. "What? You heard me," she said firmly. "Spit it out if you won't pay. I want my water back." The man's face turned red. He looked around, suddenly realizing people were watching. With an annoyed huff, he yanked out his wallet, threw a crumpled bill onto her makeshift stand, and stomped away. Lucas couldn't take his eyes off her. She wasn't just different, she was fearless. Without even realizing it, he found himself pulling his car over to the side of the street. He stepped out, his polished leather shoes clicking against the pavement as he approached. She was organizing the bottles in her cooler when she noticed his shadow falling over her. She looked up and squinted at him, her dark eyes scanning him skeptically. "You thirsty?" Lucas didn't answer right away. Up close, she was even more intriguing. She wasn't just another struggling vendor. There was something sharp in her gaze, something calculating. "How many bottles do you have?" he asked. She frowned. "Why?" He reached into his pocket and pulled out $100 bill, placing it on her table. "I'll take them all." She blinked. "All of them?" Lucas nodded. "All of them." Her arms crossed over her chest. "Trying to impress someone? Because if that's the case, don't bother. I already think you're weird enough." His lips twitched in amusement. "Let's just say I appreciate a good investment." "Oh, so water is an investment now. The market must have changed, and I didn't get the memo." Lucas held her gaze, intrigued by her quick wit. You negotiate well. You have personality. You didn't back down even when that guy tried to cheat you. She studied him for a moment before shaking her head. That still doesn't explain why a guy in a suit is dropping $100 on street water. Lucas gave a slight smile but didn't answer. Instead, he calmly picked up the bottles and carried them to his car. She watched him suspiciously. Wait, you're actually taking them all? That was the deal, wasn't it? He said smoothly. Well, yeah, but this still seems really suspicious. Lucas shrugged. Maybe I just want to help. If that's the case, save your money, she said, stuffing the bill into her pocket. I don't take handouts. He paused and looked at her, something unreadable flickering in his blue eyes. It's not a handout. I pay for what something is worth, and your time is worth way more than $2 a bottle. For a second, something in her expression softened. It was fleeting, almost imperceptible. Then just as quickly, she masked it with a smirk. Well, if you want to waste your money, I won't stop you. Lucas placed the last of the bottles in his car. Before getting in, he looked at her one last time. See you around, vendor. She frowned. If you need more water, you know where to find me. Lucas gave her a small, almost curious smile. It wasn't the smug kind he often wore in business meetings. It was something different, something even he didn't quite understand. As he drove away, he realized something strange. For the first time in a long while, his mind wasn't consumed by financial reports or corporate takeovers. Instead, it was stuck on her. And he had a feeling this wasn't the last time their paths would cross. Lucas Hayes sat in his office, the skyline of New York stretching endlessly before him, bathed in the golden hues of late afternoon. The city, alive and restless, mirrored the mind of the man who ruled it. Focused, calculated, unyielding. Deals were being made, fortunes were shifting, and somewhere in the middle of it all, Lucas sat behind his massive glass desk, reviewing reports, making decisions that would alter markets. Yet despite the empire he had built, despite the millions of dollars flowing through his fingertips, his mind was elsewhere. It was on her. It made no sense. A woman who had no wealth, no power, no influence, nothing that tied her to his world. She was a street vendor, a girl selling water for $2 on a sun-baked sidewalk. Yet her presence clung to his thoughts like a persistent melody he couldn't shake. He leaned back, rubbing his temples, replaying the encounter that had unraveled something inside him. The way she had stood her ground against that man, refusing to be intimidated. The fire in her voice, the unwavering defiance in her posture. She wasn't just surviving, she was fighting. Every single day, with the kind of strength that most people in his world could never comprehend. And then, there was the moment she looked at him, really looked at him. Not with the starstruck admiration he was used to, not with the calculating gaze of someone trying to gain favor from a man of his status. No, she looked at him with suspicion, curiosity, and most of all, unimpressed indifference. That had shaken him. He, who had spent his life commanding rooms full of billionaires, who had been on the cover of financial magazines, who had women draping themselves over him at high society galas, was being scrutinized by a girl selling water on the street. And she hadn't wanted his money. That had been the most disarming part. She hadn't flinched when he dropped $100 bill on her table. She hadn't tried to charm him, hadn't even softened her demeanor. Instead, she had challenged him, questioned him, acted as if he were the one out of place. And maybe for the first time in a long time, he was out of place. Lucas exhaled slowly, staring at the skyline. His world had always been one of power, precision, and control. Feelings had no place in it. There was no time for attachment, no space for distractions. And yet, he had spent the entire day unable to focus, his mind drifting back to that small moment of unexpected defiance. Why does she linger in my mind? He didn't have an answer, but there was only one way to find out. Without another thought, Lucas stood, grabbed his car keys, and left the office without a word to his assistant. The streets of New York buzzed with their usual chaotic energy as Lucas pulled up to the corner where he had first seen her. His expensive car looked out of place among the cracked sidewalks and faded storefronts. But he didn't care, and there she was, standing in the exact same spot, her cooler beside her, waving a bottle high in the air, calling out with the same relentless energy. He didn't know what he was expecting. Maybe that she would have disappeared. Maybe that the moment had been exaggerated in his mind. But no, she was real, and she was exactly as he remembered. She saw him the second he stepped out of his car. Her eyes narrowed slightly, her arms crossing over her chest. Well, well, she mused, tilting her head. The eccentric millionaire is back. Lucas smirked. I have a name, you know. That's great, she shot back. So tell me, Lucas, are you here to buy more water? He glanced at the cooler. Maybe. She lifted an eyebrow. Maybe? So you're not here because of the heat, huh? He kept his expression unreadable. Let's just say I was curious. A slow, ironic smile tugged at the corner of her lips. Didn't know millionaires were interested in street vendors. You seem different. And you seem like a man who doesn't take no for an answer. He smirked slightly. Did I hit a nerve? She scoffed. Do you always just show up in people's lives like this? He shrugged. Only when something catches my attention. For the first time, she seemed slightly caught off guard. It was brief, barely perceptible, but he noticed it. Then, as if regaining control, she grabbed a water bottle from her cooler and held it up between them. So, Mr. Curious, are you buying or not? Lucas took the bottle but didn't pull it from her hand just yet. His blue eyes locked onto hers. Do you think I'm eccentric for buying all your water yesterday? I do. Then what's stopping me from doing it again? Her grip tightened slightly on the bottle. Me. Lucas raised an eyebrow. You? She pulled the bottle back. I don't want you to buy everything. I sell water to survive, not so some rich guy can throw money at me for no reason. Something in her voice shifted, something raw. Lucas was silent for a few seconds. Then he took out his wallet and pulled out a $20 bill. He handed it to her without a word. She took it, but her expression hardened. If you think you can buy me, you're wrong. He didn't say anything. Instead, he twisted the cap off the bottle, took a sip, then wiped his lips with the back of his hand. Then he looked at her again. See you around, seller. And with that, he turned and walked back to his car. He expected her to let him go, to dismiss him the way she had before. But just as he was about to open the driver's side door, her voice stopped him. Wait. Lucas paused but didn't turn around. What is it? She was clutching the bill in her hands, her fingers tightening around it. Why did you do that? He turned his head slightly, just enough for her to see the shadow of his smirk. Because I wanted to. Then without another word, he got into his car and drove away. Sophia stood there, staring at the money in her hand, completely unsettled. She had met all kinds of people on these streets. Customers, businessmen, hustlers, the rich, the poor. She had seen generosity, cruelty, and everything in between. But him? Lucas Hayes was something entirely different. She had no idea what game he was playing. But something told her this wasn't the last time he would show up in her life. And the scariest part? For the first time in a long time, she didn't want him to disappear. Sophia Carter was used to being invisible. She had spent years blending into the backdrop of New York City, surviving day by day, fighting for every dollar she made. The world never handed her anything, and she never expected it to. Life had been an endless struggle, juggling college classes, late-night shifts at the restaurant, and standing on the hot pavement every afternoon selling bottled water to keep herself and her mother afloat. She had long since learned that people with money didn't see people like her, which is why Lucas Hayes unsettled her so much. Since their first encounter, he had continued showing up. At first, she assumed it was a coincidence that he just happened to be passing through, but soon she realized this was deliberate. He wasn't just stopping by, he was coming to see her. Every day, without fail, there he was. Sometimes he would buy a bottle of water. Other times, he would just lean against the street lamp, hands in his pockets, watching her as if she were some puzzle he was trying to solve. And it infuriated her. What is your deal? She asked one afternoon, arms crossed, as she glared up at him. Lucas, ever composed, smirked. I like to keep my investments close. I'm not an investment, she shot back. I'm not some project you can fix, Hayes. Lucas chuckled, taking a slow sip of water. I never said you were broken. She scoffed, turning away from him, waving another bottle at a passing pedestrian. Then stop showing up like some rich stalker. Go do whatever millionaires do. But he didn't leave. He never left. And the worst part? A tiny, annoying, traitorous part of her started expecting him to come. One particularly exhausting evening, after a long day selling water, Sophia rushed to the restaurant where she worked, barely making it in time for her shift. The air was thick with the scent of grilled food and frying oil, the kitchen bustling with activity. Her boss, Frank, a middle-aged man with a permanent scowl, was already in a bad mood. "You're late," he barked the second she stepped through the door. Sophia clenched her teeth. "I'm not late. I still have 2 minutes." Frank snorted. "Yeah? Then why don't you use those 2 minutes to clean tables instead of arguing with me?" Biting back her anger, she grabbed a rag and got to work. The restaurant was packed, loud with the hum of conversation and clinking dishes. Sophia had worked here long enough to know the drill. Keep moving, keep your head down, don't complain. But tonight, something was off. The hushed whispers started just as she finished clearing a table. "Is that him? Why would he come here?" Sophia glanced up and nearly dropped the tray in her hands. Lucas Hayes stood at the entrance, dressed impeccably in a dark navy suit that had no business being in a greasy diner. His presence sucked the air out of the room. He was too polished, too confident, too out of place, and he was looking directly at her. "What the hell?" she muttered under her breath, quickly setting the tray down and marching over to him. "You followed me here?" she hissed, keeping her voice low. Lucas arched an eyebrow. "I was in the neighborhood." She gaped at him. "Neighborhood? This is a 20-minute drive from your skyscraper kingdom, Lucas." He smirked. Traffic was light. Her frustration boiled over. "Do you enjoy making my life difficult?" "On the contrary," he said smoothly. "I think I'm making it more interesting." Sophia let out a groan, dragging a hand down her face. "You can't be here. Frank is going to lose his mind." Almost on cue, her boss stormed over. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his beady eyes narrowing as he took in Lucas's expensive suit. "Who's this guy?" Before she could answer, Lucas extended a hand. "Lucas Hayes. Pleasure to meet you." Frank didn't take the handshake. Instead, his expression darkened. "This your boyfriend or sometin, Carter?" Sophia's face went bright red. "No." Lucas, unbothered, slipped his hands into his pockets. "Just a customer. I was hoping to order something." Frank eyed him suspiciously. "You don't seem like the type that eats here." Lucas smiled. "I like to try new things." Frank let out a snort, but jerked his thumb toward an open booth. "Sit wherever." Sophia shot Lucas a glare before storming off to the kitchen, but she wasn't fast enough to miss his amused chuckle. For the next 2 hours, Lucas sat in the diner, sipping coffee and flipping through his phone as if he belonged there. Sophia had to endure whispers from coworkers, side eyes from customers, and, worst of all, Frank's relentless teasing. "You sure he's not your boyfriend?" "For the last time, no, you could do worse. I hate you." Lucas, of course, just sat there, utterly unbothered. Finally, at the end of her shift, Sophia grabbed her bag and stormed over to his booth. "All right, you've had your fun. Time to go." Lucas leaned back, tilting his head. "You seem tense." Sophia clenched her fists. "I swear, if you... Let me give you a ride home." She blinked. "What?" "It's late," he said, as if it were the most logical thing in the world. "And I highly doubt taking the bus at this hour is safe." "I always take the bus at this hour." "And now you don't have to." Sophia stared at him. "Lucas, I don't..." "Look, Carter," he interrupted, standing up and adjusting his jacket. "I don't care if you think I'm a rich stalker. I do care if something happens to you." Something in his voice, something serious, genuine, made her heart stutter. She didn't want to accept anything from him, but when she stepped outside and saw the bus stop crowded with a group of sketchy-looking men, she exhaled sharply. "Fine," she muttered, "just this once." Lucas smirked. "I'll take it." The car ride was quiet at first. Lucas drove smoothly through the city, one hand on the wheel, his expression unreadable. Sophia stared out the window, arms crossed. "Why are you really doing this?" Lucas glanced at her. "Doing what?" "Showing up, buying water you don't need, sitting in a diner for 2 hours, giving me a ride home." He was silent for a long moment before he finally said, "Because I want to." Her stomach twisted. "That's not a real answer." He sighed. "Maybe not, but it's the truth." Sophia swallowed, gripping the strap of her bag. She didn't know what to do with that answer. And deep down, she wasn't sure she wanted to. By the time Lucas pulled up in front of her apartment building, the tension in the car was thick enough to cut. "Thanks for the ride," she muttered, reaching for the door handle. But before she could step out, Lucas's voice stopped her. "Sophia," she hesitated, turning back to him. His blue eyes held something different, something she couldn't quite place. "One dinner," he said softly. "No business, no games, just two people talking." Her pulse jumped. She should say no. She wanted to say no, but against every ounce of logic in her body, she heard herself whisper, "Maybe." Lucas smiled. And for the first time in her life, Sophia felt like she had just stepped into something she wasn't sure she could walk away from. Sophia Carter had spent her whole life fighting for every scrap of stability she had. She had learned the hard way that no one would save her, that no one would swoop in and make things easier. Every dollar she made selling water, every exhausting hour she spent at the restaurant, every late-night study session running on coffee and sheer willpower, it was all on her. She wasn't a charity case. She didn't need anyone's help, or at least that's what she had told herself. But one day everything changed. The morning started like any other. Sophia woke up in the tiny apartment she shared with her mother, the sound of sirens and honking horns from the street below acting as her usual alarm. She rolled out of bed, already exhausted, and went to the sink to brush her teeth, only to find that, for the first time in weeks, the pipes weren't leaking. She froze, staring at the faucet, twisting the handle a few times. The steady drip, the one she had gotten used to tuning out, was gone. The rust-colored stains around the sink had been scrubbed away, and for a second she thought she might still be dreaming. "Mom," she called out, stepping into the small kitchen where her mother was making coffee. "Did the landlord finally decide to fix the pipes?" Her mother looked just as surprised. "I have no idea. I woke up and everything was working fine. Someone must have come while we were sleeping." Sophia frowned. That didn't make sense. Their landlord was notoriously lazy. He never fixed anything unless he was forced to. Strange. But she didn't have time to dwell on it. She had work to do. Grabbing her worn-out sneakers, she rushed out of the apartment, heading straight for the university. She had been dreading this moment for weeks, checking her overdue tuition balance. Her stomach twisted as she waited in line at the administration office, mentally calculating how much she still owed. She knew the numbers by heart. Even with all her side jobs, she was still far behind. When it was finally her turn, she stepped up to the desk, forcing herself to take a deep breath. "I need to check my tuition balance," she said. The woman at the desk clicked a few keys, scanning the screen. Then she frowned slightly. "There's no balance due." Sophia blinked. "Wait, what?" The woman turned the screen toward her. "Your tuition has been paid in full." A wave of dizziness hit her. "That's not possible." The woman gave her a polite smile. "It's already been processed." The payment was made anonymously. Sophia felt her stomach drop. Anonymous? There was only one person who would do something like this. Lucas. Her hands clenched into fists, her breathing shallow as a surge of emotions crashed into her. Anger, confusion, disbelief. How dare he? She didn't need his money. She didn't need some rich businessman stepping in and making decisions for her. Without thinking, she turned on her heel and stormed out of the building, pulling out her phone. She dialed his number, her heart pounding with fury. The phone rang 3 times before he picked up. "Sophia," Lucas's calm voice greeted her. Her fingers tightened around the phone. "Don't you Sophia me, Lucas?" There was a pause. "I take it you found out." She let out a sharp breath. "You paid my tuition." Another pause. "Yes," her jaw clenched. "Why?" "Because I could." Her vision blurred with frustration. "That's not an answer." Lucas exhaled slowly. "Sophia, No," she cut him off. "You don't get to do this. You don't get to make choices about my life without asking me first." "I didn't ask for your help." "I know," he admitted, "but you needed it." Something inside her snapped. "You think just because you have money, you get to control everything? That you can just throw cash at my problems and make them go away?" "Sophia, that's not what I—" "It is what you did," she shouted. "You paid off my tuition like I was some project, like I was something you needed to fix." Lucas was silent for a long moment. Then in a voice quieter than before, he said, I didn't do it to fix you. I did it because I care about you. The words hit her like a blow to the chest. She had no response, because deep down she knew it was true. But that didn't make it easier to accept. Her entire life, she had been told she had to work for everything, that nothing came for free, that the moment you started relying on someone else, you became weak. And yet here was Lucas Hayes, a man who had everything, telling her he cared. Her throat tightened. I have to go, she muttered, hanging up before he could say anything else. She needed space. She needed to breathe. For the rest of the day, she tried to push it aside. She threw herself into work, selling water, scrubbing tables at the restaurant, anything to distract herself. But then the whispers started. She overheard them while clearing a table. Did you hear? One of the other employees whispered. Hear what? Apparently the restaurant has a new owner. Sophia frowned. What? When did that happen? Recently. And get this, it was some anonymous buyer. But word is he did it because of someone who works here. Sophia's stomach clenched. No, he wouldn't have. Would he? By the time she stormed into Mitchell Enterprises, her fury was a wildfire. The receptionist barely had time to protest before she marched straight to Lucas's office, pushing the door open without knocking. Lucas looked up from his desk, unsurprised. Sophia, she slammed the door behind her. Tell me you didn't do it. He sighed. Do what? Her hands shook as she pointed at him. Don't play dumb. You bought the restaurant. Lucas leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. It was a business move. She let out a humorless laugh. Bullshit. He stood walking around the desk. I didn't want you working under someone who treated you like garbage. Sophia shook her head. You don't get to make that choice for me. His jaw tightened. So you'd rather stay in a place where you're overworked and underpaid? I'd rather have a say in my own damn life. He took a step closer, his blue eyes locked onto hers. And what if I just wanted to make things easier for you? Sophia swallowed, her heart pounding. Then you should have asked. Lucas exhaled sharply. Would you have let me? Silence, because they both knew the answer. No, she wouldn't have, because she didn't know how to accept help. Tears burned the back of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. You don't get to decide what's best for me, Lucas. His expression softened. I just wanted to take some of the weight off your shoulders. Sophia clenched her fists. And now I just feel like I owe you. Lucas shook his head. You don't owe me anything. Her chest ached. Then why does it feel like I do? He hesitated before answering. Because no one's ever done this for you before. And that was the problem, wasn't it? No one had. No one had ever cared enough to fight for her, to stand in her corner, to help without expecting something in return. Sophia turned toward the door. I need to think. Lucas didn't stop her, and that terrified her more than anything. That night, Sophia lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying his words over and over again. Maybe he wasn't trying to control her. Maybe he was just trying to show her something she had never known before, what it meant to be loved. And for the first time in her life, she didn't know whether to run away from it or run toward it. Sophia Carter stormed through the gleaming lobby of Mitchell Enterprises, her heart pounding so hard she could barely hear the clicking of her worn-out sneakers against the pristine marble floor. She had spent the entire night tossing and turning, replaying the events of the last few days in her mind. The tuition, the restaurant, the anonymous repairs to her apartment. And every single time, the answer was the same. Lucas. It had to be him. And that realization made something snap inside her. For years, she had fought her own battles. She had scraped by, doing whatever it took to keep herself and her mother afloat. She had worked through exhaustion, through hunger, through the bone-deep ache of knowing she had no safety net, no one to fall back on. And now, suddenly, he wanted to swoop in and change everything? No, she wouldn't let him. The receptionist barely had time to lift her head before Sophia stormed past, throwing open the heavy glass doors of Lucas's office without knocking. He was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his broad shoulders framed by the New York skyline, a phone pressed to his ear. The moment he saw her, he murmured a quick, "I'll call you back," and ended the call. Sophia, his voice was calm, but there was something unreadable in his blue eyes. She slammed the door behind her, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. You paid my tuition. Lucas slipped his phone into his pocket, watching her carefully. I did. Her jaw clenched. You bought the restaurant where I work. His expression remained unreadable. Yes. She took a shaky breath, her hands curling into fists. You're fixing things without asking me. She broke off, shaking her head, her throat tightening. You're trying to control my life. Lucas sighed, running a hand through his hair. That's not what this is. Then what is it? She demanded, her voice rising. Do you feel sorry for me, Lucas? Is that it? Is this some kind of charity project for you? Something flickered in his gaze, something sharp, something dangerous. Don't. His voice was low, controlled. Don't what? She snapped. Tell the truth? He took a step closer. Don't twist this into something it's not. Sophia let out a harsh, humorless laugh. Oh, I'm twisting things? You didn't think to ask me how I felt before dropping thousands of dollars on my tuition? Before buying the restaurant where I work? She swallowed hard, her voice cracking. You don't get to decide what's best for me, Lucas. He exhaled sharply, his jaw tightening. I wasn't trying to decide for you. Then what were you doing? A beat of silence stretched between them. Then quietly he said, I was trying to make things easier for you. Sophia froze. Her chest ached, her throat burned, but she forced herself to hold her ground. I don't need you to make things easier for me. Lucas's eyes darkened. You're right. You don't need me. You've been fighting your whole life without anyone's help. But, Sophia, he took another step forward, his voice rough with frustration. Just because you can do it alone doesn't mean you have to. Her breath caught in her throat. She hated how much those words affected her. She hated that some small part of her wanted to believe him. Lucas sighed, his gaze softening. I didn't do this to control you. I didn't do it because I think you are weak. I did it because... He hesitated for half a second before continuing. Because I care about you. Sophia swallowed hard, forcing herself to look away. You can't care about me. He flinched slightly as if she had struck him. Why not? Because people like you don't fall for people like me, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Lucas took another step forward, closing the space between them. Who told you that? She let out a shaky breath. Life. Lucas's expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something raw, something real. I don't care what life told you, he murmured. I care about you. That's not something you get to decide for me. Her chest ached, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure he could hear it. She wanted to push him away. She wanted to run because if she didn't, she might actually start believing him. I don't know how to let someone help me, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Lucas's gaze softened. Then let me teach you. Tears burned behind her eyes, and she hated that he could see the cracks forming in her armor. She had spent years building walls. And with a few simple words, he was tearing them down. I don't want to owe you, she whispered. Lucas let out a quiet, almost bitter laugh. You don't owe me, Sophia. She shook her head. Then why does it feel like I do? He sighed. Because no one's ever done this for you before. Her throat tightened. He was right. No one had. She had spent her whole life clawing her way forward, expecting nothing from anyone, always ready to be abandoned. And now here he was. A man who had everything. A man who could have anyone. Standing in front of her, asking for nothing, just trying to stay. Her breath hitched. Let me go, she whispered, her voice breaking. Lucas stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then finally he nodded. If that's what you want. Sophia turned before he could see the tears slip down her cheeks, before she could change her mind. She didn't stop walking, didn't look back, didn't let herself hesitate. But as she stepped into the elevator, her hands shaking, her heart breaking, she realized something terrifying. She didn't want him to let her go. She had just spent her entire life believing she had no other choice. Do you think Sophia made the right choice? Should she let Lucas in? Tell us in the comments below. If you love emotional stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe for more heartwarming content. Sophia Carter had always been good at pretending. Pretending she wasn't exhausted when she dragged herself home after long shifts. pretending she wasn't terrified of failing when she stayed up all night studying for exams she could barely afford to take, pretending she didn't care when people looked at her like she was less than them just because she had nothing to her name but her stubbornness and a handful of dreams. But this was something else entirely. Pretending she didn't feel anything for Lucas Hayes was getting harder by the day. She told herself she was being smart, that falling for him, a billionaire, a man so far removed from her world, was the kind of mistake that could break her. But then there were moments when he looked at her, when his blue eyes softened just a fraction, when he said her name like it meant something, like she meant something, and that terrified her more than anything. Because she had spent her entire life building walls, and Lucas was walking right through them like they weren't even there. It wasn't supposed to be like this. She wasn't supposed to care. She wasn't supposed to notice the way her stomach flipped every time she saw him, or the way his presence felt different than anyone else's, as if the air around him shifted, as if everything about him demanded attention without him even trying. But more than anything, she wasn't supposed to let him in. And yet, "You're avoiding me, Buite," Lucas said one evening, his voice calm but firm. Sophia flinched. She hadn't expected to run into him tonight. Not here, not at this hour. She had just finished her shift at the restaurant, the exhaustion clinging to her like a second skin. The city was quieter now, the streets bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. The night smelled like rain, the cool air a sharp contrast to the warmth of the diner she had just left. And yet, somehow, Lucas was here. He stood near his car, hands in his pockets, watching her in that unreadable way of his. "I'm not avoiding you," she muttered, adjusting the strap of her bag. Lucas tilted his head slightly. "Really?" She swallowed, keeping her gaze on the pavement. "You're overthinking things." A beat of silence stretched between them. Then he sighed. "Sophia." Her name, spoken so softly, made something ache deep in her chest. She squeezed her eyes shut for a second before forcing herself to meet his gaze. "Lucas, why are you here?" He studied her for a moment before answering. "Because I wanted to see you." Her heart skipped a beat. She let out a small, humorless laugh, shaking her head. "You say that like it's normal, like it's not crazy that a man like you keeps showing up for someone like me." Lucas's expression didn't change. "And why is that crazy?" "Because you're you," she said, exasperated. "And I'm me." His brows furrowed slightly. "What does that even mean?" She took a shaky breath, trying to find the right words, trying to explain the impossible knot of emotions twisting inside her. "It means," she said quietly, "that I don't belong in your world, and you don't belong in mine." Lucas was quiet for a moment. Then he took a step closer. "That's bullshit." Her eyes widened slightly. He continued, his voice unwavering. "You think I don't know what people say? That I don't hear the whispers, the rumors? That I haven't noticed the way you flinch every time someone brings up the fact that I have money, that I live differently than you?" Sophia clenched her jaw, looking away. "Because it's true." "No," he said firmly. "It's not." She let out a bitter laugh. "Lucas, come on." "I don't care about any of that," he interrupted, his voice sharp now, impatient. "I don't care about the money, or the status, or the world I come from. I care about you." Her breath hitched. "I care about the girl who stands on the sidewalk in the blistering heat, selling water with the kind of determination that CEOs would kill for. I care about the girl who doesn't back down from a fight, who refuses to let the world break her. I care about the girl who's too damn proud to let herself be helped, even when she needs it." He stepped even closer, his voice dropping to something almost desperate. "And you know what pisses me off the most, Sophia?" She swallowed hard. "What?" "That you care about me too." Silence. The kind that stretched too long, too thick, the weight of unspoken truths pressing against her chest like a vice. Her throat tightened. "Lucas, don't lie to me," he murmured. "Don't stand here and pretend you don't feel it too." Her hands trembled. She wanted to deny it, wanted to push him away, to run before it was too late. But she couldn't, because he was right. She did care, and that was the problem. She took a shaky breath. "I don't know how to do this, Lucas." His expression softened, just a fraction. "Do what?" She swallowed hard. "Let someone in." Lucas was quiet for a moment. Then gently he reached for her hand. She almost pulled away. Almost, but she didn't. Instead, she let him take it, his fingers warm against her own. You don't have to know, he murmured. You just have to try ma. Her throat burned, because trying meant opening herself up to something she couldn't control. Trying meant trusting someone in a way she never had before. Trying meant risking something real. And for someone like her, someone who had spent her whole life surviving, that was terrifying. Lucas squeezed her hand just slightly. One step at a time, Carter. Sophia let out a shaky laugh, blinking back the tears threatening to spill over. One step at a time, she whispered. Lucas smiled, and for the first time in her life, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to do it alone. Sophia Carter had never cared what people thought of her. She had spent too many years scraping by, too many nights worrying about rent and tuition, too many days fighting for every dollar on the street corner where she sold water. She had long since learned that people's opinions didn't pay the bills, that whispers didn't put food on the table, that judgment didn't change the reality she lived in. But suddenly, it did. Suddenly, her name was being spoken in places it never belonged. Suddenly, people were looking at her, not as just another struggling girl trying to survive, but as Lucas Hayes's, what, toy, mistake, plaything? The word girlfriend didn't seem to fit. Not in their world, not in his world. It started with the whispers. At first, she ignored them. When she walked into her university, head down, focused on getting to class, she barely noticed the hushed murmurs, the stolen glances. She thought maybe she was imagining it, that she was being paranoid. But then it got worse. People started staring. She would walk past a group of students, and suddenly their conversation would drop to hushed tones, their eyes flickering toward her, their smirks and giggles barely hidden. At work, customers whispered behind their menus, their voices laced with curiosity and amusement. She's the one, right? She has to be. No way he'd go for her otherwise. She doesn't even belong in that world. What could someone like her possibly have to offer someone like Lucas Hayes? Sophia clenched her jaw, forced herself to ignore it, because that was the reality of being with him. People saw her, judged her, measured her against him, and found her lacking. The first time she saw her own face in a headline, her stomach dropped. She was leaving her apartment, coffee in hand, when her phone buzzed with an incoming message from one of her coworkers. You might want to see this. Attached was a screenshot of an online article. Who is Sophia Carter, the mystery girl who caught Lucas Hayes' eye? Her breath hitched. Heart pounding, she opened the link, her hands shaking as she read. It was worse than she imagined. There were pictures, paparazzi shots of her walking home, standing at her water stand, even a blurred image of her and Lucas in his car. The article speculated on everything: where she came from, what she wanted from Lucas, why he would be interested in her, a nobody, a girl with no family name, no money, nothing that made her worthy of the world he lived in. And then, at the bottom of the page, there was a quote from Naomi Stanford. Naomi Stanford, a longtime acquaintance of Mr. Hayes and respected socialite, had this to say: "It's cute, really. I think every man has his rebellion phase, but eventually people return to their world, where they belong." Sophia felt sick. She stormed into Lucas's office that evening, her emotions a tangled mess of rage, humiliation, and something else, something raw, something vulnerable. He was behind his desk, deep in thought, but the moment she walked in, his eyes snapped to hers. He frowned. "Sophia, what's wrong?" She threw the phone onto his desk. "This." Lucas glanced down, his jaw tightening as he saw the article. His expression darkened. "Who sent you this?" "Does it matter?" she shot back. "It's everywhere. People are talking about me, Lucas. About us." He sighed, rubbing a hand down his face. "I know, huh?" Her stomach twisted. "You knew?" Lucas stood, walking around the desk toward her. "Sophia, I didn't want to tell you because I knew this would upset you. I was handling it." "Handling it?" she repeated, her voice rising. "Lucas, people are treating me like I'm some joke." His expression hardened. "You're not a joke." "Then why does it feel like I am?" she whispered. Silence. Lucas reached for her hand, but she pulled away. His face flickered with something almost like hurt. Sophia, he said carefully, you knew this wouldn't be easy. Her chest ached. I knew people would talk, Lucas, but I didn't expect them to treat me like I'm just some phase you'll grow out of. Lucas's jaw tightened. That's Naomi talking. She's bitter. Sophia let out a humorless laugh. It's not just her, Lucas. It's everyone. She turned away, crossing her arms over her chest. You live in a world where I don't fit, and every single person in it knows that. That's not true, he said firmly. She scoffed. Isn't it? Then why am I the one being picked apart in these articles? Why is no one questioning you? Lucas sighed. Because they already know me. They know what to expect. But you're new, Dash, and people hate what they don't understand. Sophia swallowed hard, her throat burning. So what? I just have to live with it? Lucas was silent for a moment. Then softly he said, I can't change the way people talk, but I can stand by you through it. Her heart clenched. Because that was the thing. Lucas would stand by her. He would protect her, fight for her, defend her against every rumor and whisper. But she wasn't sure she could handle that. Not because she didn't love him, but because she had spent her whole life learning how to survive on her own. And this was a battle she wasn't sure she knew how to fight. She looked up at him, her eyes searching his. Lucas, do you really think this can work? He stepped closer, his voice steady. I know it can. Sophia let out a shaky breath. But what if I can't handle it? Lucas was quiet for a long moment. Then gently he said, then we take it one step at a time. Her throat tightened. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that love was enough, that they were enough. But as she looked at him, standing so sure, so certain in his belief that they could withstand anything, she wondered if she was the one who would end up breaking first. Sophia Carter had never been to a place like this before. The grand ballroom was bathed in golden light, chandeliers dripping from the ceiling like frozen waterfalls. The scent of expensive champagne and polished wood filled the air, mingling with the quiet hum of whispered conversations and the occasional clinking of crystal glasses. The room was alive with wealth, men in tailored suits, women in designer gowns, laughter that was too controlled, too calculated. And in the middle of it all, she stood. A girl who had spent her life working late shifts, who had learned to survive on stubbornness in $2 bottles of water. She didn't belong here. She knew it. And judging by the looks she was getting, so did everyone else. The invitation had come out of nowhere. Lucas had mentioned it casually, as if it were just another part of his life. There's a fundraiser tomorrow night. I'd like you to come with me. Sophia had stared at him like he had just asked her to fly a plane. You want me to come? Lucas had smirked. Why does that surprise you? She folded her arms. Because I don't do fundraisers, Lucas. I sell water on the street. I don't sip champagne and pretend to know what caviar is. His expression softened. You don't have to pretend to be anything you're not. I just want you there. And that was the problem, wasn't it? Because every time he looked at her like that, every time he chose her despite everything, she felt the walls around her cracking. She should have said no. She almost did. But somehow she had found herself standing in front of a mirror hours later, smoothing down the fabric of the dress she had borrowed from a friend, staring at her own reflection like a stranger. She had gone. And now, standing in the middle of this ballroom, she wondered if she had made a mistake. She could feel the stares. Every conversation seemed to pause when she walked past. Every whisper felt heavier, filled with curiosity, with disbelief. What is she doing here? Is that her, the girl from the article? There's no way he's serious about her. She swallowed, keeping her head high. She wouldn't let them see how much it hurt. She wouldn't let them see how much she wanted to run. And then she heard her voice. Naomi Stanford. Sophia turned just in time to see the tall, blonde socialite stepping toward her, a glass of champagne in hand and a smirk that didn't quite reach her eyes. So, Naomi said, tilting her head, you're the famous Sophia Carter. Sophia forced a smile. And you're the famous Naomi Stanford. Naomi chuckled, sipping her drink. I suppose we were bound to meet eventually. Sophia crossed her arms. Were we? Oh, absolutely, Naomi said smoothly. After all, we have something in common. Sophia arched an eyebrow. And what's that? Naomi leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. We both know this won't last. Sophia's stomach twisted, but she didn't flinch. You sound awfully sure about that. Naomi gave her a look that was almost pitying. Sweetheart, I am sure. Lucas is Lucas. He belongs in this world. And you? She let her gaze flicker down Sophia's dress for just a second before smiling. You don't. Sophia felt something inside her crack, but before she could respond, before she could even process the burning in her throat, a familiar voice cut through the air. Naomi? Lucas. He was suddenly beside her, his presence solid, grounding. Naomi's smirk widened. Lucas, darling, we were just chatting. His jaw tightened. I'm sure you were. Sophia could feel the tension humming between them, thick and unspoken. Naomi sighed, finishing her drink. I should be going. Enjoy your evening. She let her fingers trail along Lucas's arm before turning to Sophia. And good luck. Then she was gone. Sophia let out a slow breath, her hands trembling. Lucas turned to her. Are you okay? She let out a sharp laugh. Am I okay? Lucas, she's right. His brow furrowed. What? She shook her head, her voice raw. I don't belong here. I never have. And no matter how hard I try, people like her will always see me as some kind of mistake. Lucas exhaled, stepping closer. I don't care what Naomi thinks. She looked up at him, eyes burning. But I do. Silence. Lucas stared at her, something unreadable in his gaze. Then, without warning, he grabbed her hand. Before she could react, he was leading her across the ballroom. Lucas, what are you doing? She hissed. But he didn't stop. And then, suddenly, they were standing in front of everyone. The murmurs grew louder. The whispers became a roar. Sophia's stomach dropped. Lucas. But then he turned to face the room, his grip on her hand tightening. And in the clearest, strongest voice, he said, I love her. The world stopped. The whispers fell into stunned silence. Sophia's breath caught in her own throat. Lucas turned to her, his eyes burning. I love you, Sophia. His voice was steady, unwavering. And I don't care what anyone here thinks. I don't care what they say or what they expect of me. The only thing I care about is you. Her heart pounded so hard it hurt. He squeezed her hand. I know this isn't easy. I know this world is cruel. But you are not a mistake. You are not some phase. You are the best damn thing that has ever happened to me. Tears blurred her vision. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All she knew was that Lucas Hayes, the man who had everything, was standing in front of the wealthiest people in the city, declaring his love for a girl who had nothing. The air around them was thick, suffocating. And then he spoke the words that shattered everything. But if you don't feel the same way, his voice faltered just slightly, just enough for her to hear the fear in it. Then tell me now, and I'll walk away. Sophia's chest ached, because she did feel the same. She loved him. She knew she did. But loving him meant stepping into a world that would never accept her. Loving him meant fighting every day to prove she was enough. Loving him meant risking everything. Her throat closed. She wasn't ready. Not yet. So instead of answering, she whispered, I need time. Lucas's eyes flickered with something, hurt, disappointment, but he nodded. Okay, he said softly. Then, without another word, he let go of her hand. And for the first time since meeting him, she felt cold. Sophia Carter never thought she'd know what it felt like to break her own heart. She had spent her entire life fighting to survive, clawing her way through every obstacle, pushing forward even when the world told her she would never make it. She had worked too many late nights, sacrificed too much, built walls too high to ever let herself become dependent on anyone. And yet, here she was, standing in Lucas Hayes' office, her hands clenched into fists, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it might break free from her chest. She had to do this. She had to, because if she didn't walk away now, she might never be able to. It had started with a whisper. She hadn't meant to overhear it. One of her co-workers at the restaurant had been talking in hushed tones near the register, but Sophia had caught just enough to send ice through her veins. Did you hear? The place got bought out. Yeah, I heard. And guess who the new owner is? Who? Lucas Hayes. The world had tilted. For a moment, she thought she had misheard. that she had imagined it. But then she saw the way they looked at her, the half smirks, the pity. He must be doing it for her. Guess being with a billionaire has its perks, huh? Sophia felt like she was going to be sick. She hadn't needed anyone to rescue her. She hadn't asked him to step in. And yet, here he was, buying the restaurant, making decisions about her life without even telling her. That was when she realized it. This wasn't just about the restaurant. It was about everything, the tuition, the apartment repairs, the way he always stepped in before she could even struggle. Lucas wasn't just trying to help her. He was trying to control her. And that was something she could never allow. So now here she was. Lucas was behind his desk when she stormed into his office, looking up in mild surprise. Sophia? His brow furrowed as he took in her expression. What's wrong? She let out a shaky breath, her fists trembling at her sides. Tell me it's not true. Lucas's gaze darkened. He set down his pen, standing slowly. Tell you what's not true. She swallowed hard. You bought the restaurant. A beat of silence. Then he sighed. Yes. Her heart broke, because of course he had. Of course he had. She forced out a laugh, sharp and humorless. And when were you planning to tell me, Lucas? He exhaled, stepping toward her. Sophia, She took a step back. No, don't. Just don't. Lucas's jaw tightened. I did it to help you. Her breath caught in her throat. That's the problem, Lucas. He frowned. What do you mean? She shook her head, wrapping her arms around herself as if that could hold her together. You don't even see it, do you? Her voice cracked. You keep fixing things in my life without even asking me. You think you're helping, but all you're doing is making me feel like I can't do anything on my own. Lucas's expression darkened. That's not true. She let out a harsh breath. Munit, do you even realize what it's like to have someone step in and make decisions for you? Her eyes burned. I have fought my entire life to stand on my own 2 feet. Lucas, I have never had the luxury of someone catching me when I fall. I don't know how to be taken care of, and I don't want to be. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. So you're mad at me for caring? She looked at him, her heart breaking. I'm mad at you for not trusting me to handle my own life. His breath hitched. Sophia, she shook her head, stepping back again. This isn't working. Lucas's face twisted in something almost like pain. Don't say that. But she had to. She had to. Because if she didn't do this now, she would never be able to walk away. And if she stayed? If she let him keep saving her? She would never be her again. She took a shaky breath. I can't be with someone who doesn't see me as their equal. Lucas flinched. I do see you as my equal. She laughed bitterly. Then why do you keep making choices for me? Silence. The truth was there, hanging between them like shattered glass. Lucas exhaled, his jaw tightening. So what are you saying? Her chest ached. Her body screamed at her to stop, to not do this, but she ignored the pain, because this was the only way to protect herself. She forced the words past the lump in her throat. I think we need to end this. Lucas stilled, his hands once clenched, slowly relaxed at his sides. His shoulders tensed, and for the first time since she had met him, Lucas Hayes looked lost. She had expected him to argue, to fight, but he didn't. He just stared at her, something unreadable in his eyes. Finally, he exhaled. If that's what you want. Her chest caved in, because she had expected him to fight for her. She had wanted him to fight for her, but instead he was letting her go. Tears burned her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She turned away, reaching for the door. But just before she could leave, Lucas's voice stopped her. Soft, quiet, almost broken. Sophia. She swallowed hard, eyes shut tight. Yeah? A pause, then in a voice so low she almost didn't hear it, he whispered, I love you. Her breath hitched. Tears spilled over before she could stop them. She didn't turn around, because if she saw him, if she saw the pain in his eyes, she would never be able to leave. So she gripped the door handle and forced herself to whisper, Goodbye, Lucas. And then she walked out, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't sure if she had won the battle she had been fighting, or if she had just lost everything. Lucas Hayes was not the kind of man who waited. His entire life had been built on action, on control. If something was broken, he fixed it. If something stood in his way, he removed it. That was how he had built his empire, how he had become the man people feared, admired, envied. But for the first time in his life, he was powerless. For the first time, there was something he wanted, someone he wanted, who had walked away, and he didn't know how to fix it. Sophia Carter was gone, and in her absence, the world felt empty. Days passed, then a week, then two. And with each passing moment, Lucas realized that his life, his carefully structured, perfectly controlled existence, was nothing without her. He had tried to move on, tried to bury himself in work, in meetings, in numbers, but no matter how many deals he closed, no matter how many zeros he added to his bank account, it didn't matter, because she wasn't there. Because for the first time in his life, money couldn't fix this. But maybe he could. It was a scorching afternoon when Sophia Carter dragged herself back to her usual spot on the sidewalk, setting up her cooler of water bottles, just as she had done 100 times before. The sun was relentless, pressing down on the city like a weight. Sweat clung to the back of her neck as she wiped her forehead, exhaustion already settling deep in her bones. She had thought the heartbreak would ease with time, that walking away from Lucas would feel like freedom. But instead, it felt like she was carrying something too heavy for her chest to bear. She tried not to think about him, tried not to imagine what he was doing, if he had already moved on, if she had been just another passing phase in his life. But then, she saw him, and her world stopped. At first, she thought she was hallucinating, because there was no way that Lucas Hayes was standing on the sidewalk next to a worn-out cooler, holding up a bottle of water and calling out, "Ice-cold water, $2 a bottle!" Sophia blinked, once, twice, but he didn't disappear. He was really there, dressed in a simple t-shirt and jeans that were definitely too expensive to be standing on this filthy pavement, his dark hair tousled by the breeze, his sleeves rolled up, his Rolex missing from his wrist. And he was selling water, just like her. Sophia's heart pounded. Pedestrians walked past him, some giving him odd looks, others pausing to buy a bottle, not recognizing the man who had once been photographed at billion-dollar fundraisers, standing beside the world's elite. But he didn't care. Lucas didn't care about the looks. He didn't care about the sweat dripping down his temple. He didn't care about anything, except the girl standing just feet away, staring at him like she had forgotten how to breathe. Sophia forced herself to move, forced herself to breathe. She stormed toward him, ignoring the customers around him, ignoring the way her chest felt too tight. "What the hell are you doing?" Lucas turned, his blue eyes locking onto hers, and, God help her, he smiled. A slow, genuine, heartbreaking smile. "Selling water," he said simply. Sophia's hands clenched into fists. "Lucas, you didn't want me in your world," he interrupted gently, "so I figured I'd step into yours." Her breath caught. "Are you insane?" she hissed. "You don't belong here." His eyes softened. "Neither do you." Sophia flinched, because that was the thing, wasn't it? She had spent so much time fighting for independence, so much time convincing herself that she didn't need help, that she had refused to see what was right in front of her. Lucas had never wanted to change her. He had never tried to own her. All he had wanted was to stand beside her, and now he was proving it in the only way she would believe, by standing in her world, doing what she did. Her throat tightened. "Lucas," she whispered. He stepped closer, his voice softer now, but still steady. "You walked away because you thought I didn't understand you, because you thought I didn't see you as my equal." His Adam's apple bobbed. "But you were wrong." Sophia's chest ached. "I see you, Sophia," he continued, his voice raw with emotion. "I see every part of you. I see the strength it takes to wake up every morning and fight for your future. I see the way you refuse to break, even when the world tries to crush you. I see you." Tears burned in her eyes. "And if I have to stand on this sidewalk every damn day, selling $2 water bottles just to prove that to you," he smiled, shaking his head, "then that's exactly what I'll do." A tear slipped down her cheek, because no one, no one had ever fought for her like this. No one had ever chosen her like this. She had spent her whole life believing that love meant losing herself, that accepting help meant weakness. But Lucas was showing her that love wasn't about control. It wasn't about being saved. It was about standing together. She exhaled shakily, staring at him through her tears. "You're an idiot," Lucas chuckled. I know." She shook her head, her voice breaking. "But you're my idiot." A slow smile spread across his lips. "Does that mean what I think it means?" Sophia let out a watery laugh before stepping forward and gripping the front of his shirt, pulling him down into a desperate, breathless kiss. Lucas melted into her, his hands coming up to cradle her face, as if he was terrified she would slip away again, as if he had been waiting for this, as if he had never stopped loving her. And the moment their lips met, Sophia knew she had made the biggest mistake of her life by walking away. But Lucas had never stopped fighting for her. When they finally pulled apart, Lucas rested his forehead against hers, his breathing unsteady. "So," he murmured, "does this mean I get to stop selling water now?" Sophia laughed, wiping at her eyes. "Maybe," Lucas smirked. "Good, because I think I suck at it." She grinned, shaking her head. "Yeah, you really do." And for the first time in her life, Sophia Carter realized that love, real love, wasn't about standing alone. It was about choosing to stand together, and she would never walk away from it again. What do you think? Did Lucas prove his love the right way? Should Sophia have fought for him sooner? Tell us in the comments below. If this story moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more heart-touching content. Sophia Carter had spent her whole life running from failure, running from expectations, running from the fear of needing someone and being left behind. And for the longest time, she had told herself that running was survival. But now, as she stood in the middle of her tiny apartment, staring at the tear-stained pillow she had cried into the night before, she realized the truth. She hadn't just been running from life. She had been running from him, from Lucas, from the way he looked at her like she was everything, from the way he believed in her even when she didn't believe in herself, from the way he fought for her over and over, never once backing down. She had pushed him away because she was terrified. Terrified that if she let him in, if she let herself need him, he would become something she couldn't live without. And that was exactly what had happened. Because now, without him, nothing felt right. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. She loved him. She loved Lucas Hayes. And she had walked away from him. Her breath shuddered as she dropped onto the couch, her hands gripping the fabric like it could hold her together. She had thought leaving was the right choice, that keeping her independence meant letting him go. But now she understood. Independence didn't mean being alone. It didn't mean shutting out the one person who had seen her, truly seen her, for who she was and still stayed. It didn't mean walking away from the best damn thing that had ever happened to her. Sophia felt something inside her snap. She couldn't keep doing this. Couldn't keep pretending that losing him hadn't destroyed her. Couldn't keep acting like she could breathe without him. She had spent too much time running, and for the first time in her life, she needed to stop. She ran down the street, her pulse hammering in her ears, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. She didn't stop. Not when the sidewalks blurred around her. Not when the city seemed too big, too loud, too overwhelming. She just ran, because if she didn't, she would lose him. And this time, there would be no second chances. This time, if she lost him, it would be her fault. Her stomach twisted as she reached the towering glass building of Mitchell Enterprises, Lucas's empire, the world he had built, and the world she had convinced herself she could never be a part of. She had been wrong. Sophia took a deep breath and pushed through the doors. The receptionist blinked at her in surprise. "Miss Carter?" But Sophia barely heard her. She was already moving. Her heart slammed against her ribs as she reached the elevator, jabbing at the button like her life depended on it. Because it did. Because he was on the other side of that door, and she was about to risk everything to get him back. The door slid open, revealing the sleek, silent floor of Lucas's office. He was there, sitting behind his massive desk, staring out at the city like he was lost in thought, like he was somewhere else, like she had already lost him. Her chest tightened. But then, he turned, and when his eyes met hers, everything stopped. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of everything that had happened between them hung thick in the air. Then slowly Lucas stood. "Sophia," he said, his voice unreadable. She swallowed hard, taking a shaky step forward. I know I shouldn't be here." Lucas's expression was careful, too careful. "Then why are you here?" Her breath hitched. Because this was it. The moment where she either fought for him or walked away forever. Sophia clenched her fists, her pulse racing. "I made a mistake," she admitted, her voice shaking. Lucas's jaw tightened. "What kind of mistake?" Her throat burned. "The kind that almost cost me the best thing in my life," she whispered. Lucas exhaled sharply, dragging a hand down his face. "Sophia, don't." "No," she cut him off, stepping closer. "You don't. You don't get to tell me not to say it. Not when you never gave up on me. Not when you kept showing up, even when I pushed you away. Not when you fought for me when I wouldn't fight for myself." Lucas's eyes darkened, but he didn't interrupt, so she kept going. "I was afraid," she admitted, her voice cracking. "Afraid that if I let you in, I'd lose myself. That if I needed you, I'd wake up one day and you'd be gone. Because that's what happens, Lucas. People leave. They always leave." Lucas flinched, and for the first time she saw the hurt in his eyes. "Sophia," he murmured, his voice rough. She shook her head, tears burning behind her eyes. "But you didn't leave. You stayed. You fought. You proved to me over and over that you weren't going anywhere." A tear slipped down her cheek. "And I love you for that." Lucas's breath hitched. For the first time since she had met him, he looked stunned, like he had never expected to hear those words. Sophia wiped her face, letting out a shaky laugh. "God, I should have said that sooner." Lucas just stared at her, like she was something impossible, like she was something he had been waiting for his whole life. Then in one breath, one single moment, he closed the distance between them. And suddenly, his arms were around her. And suddenly, she was home. His lips crashed into hers, desperate and breathless and real. And Sophia melted into him like she had been waiting for this forever. Because maybe she had. Maybe from the moment he had walked into her life, from the moment he had challenged her, from the moment he had seen her, she had always been his. And now she wasn't running anymore. She was choosing him. Lucas pulled back just enough to rest his forehead against hers, his breath unsteady. "Say it again," he murmured. Sophia smiled through her tears. "I love you, Lucas Hayes." His eyes closed, like those words had just stitched something inside him back together. And when he kissed her again, slow and deep and unshakable, Sophia knew. She had been so afraid that love would take something from her. But loving Lucas? It had only ever made her whole. Sophia Carter never imagined that love could feel like this, like warmth spreading through her chest, like the steady rhythm of a heartbeat that no longer raced in fear, but settled in quiet certainty, like knowing, when truly knowing that she was exactly where she was meant to be. And yet, here she was, standing in the very spot where it had all begun, the place where Lucas Hayes had first walked into her life, the street corner where she had stood for years, waving bottles of water, calling out to passing pedestrians, fighting for every single dollar. The place where she had met the man who would change her world in ways she never saw coming. Her fingers trembled slightly as she looked up at him, the neon city lights reflecting in his blue eyes, his expression unreadable. There was something different about him tonight, something that made her heart stutter in her chest, something that made her realize, before he even spoke, that this was going to be a moment she would remember for the rest of her life. She hadn't expected this. When Lucas had called her earlier that evening, his voice had been calm, casual. "Meet me where it all started." She had frowned at the cryptic message but hadn't questioned it. And now, standing in the warm summer night air, she was glad she hadn't. Because when she arrived, she found the sidewalk transformed. Small fairy lights hung from the street lamp, casting a soft golden glow. A simple table had been set up next to her old water cooler, covered with a white cloth and two mismatched chairs. A small bouquet of wildflowers sat in the center of the table. Sophia's breath caught. It wasn't grand, it wasn't extravagant, it was perfect. Her heart ached with something deep and unshakable. Because Lucas Hayes, billionaire, businessman, a man who could afford the most luxurious of settings, had chosen this place, her place, their place. And somehow that meant more than anything money could ever buy. She turned to face him, her voice barely above a whisper. Lucas, what is this? He smiled, slipping his hands into his pockets. Dinner. She let out a soft, incredulous laugh. On a sidewalk? His lips twitched. Thought it might be nice to change things up. Get a little nostalgic. She shook her head, a warmth blooming in her chest. You're ridiculous. Lucas's eyes softened. I know. And just like that, the tension in her shoulders melted. Because this was them. No pretenses, no expectations, just the easy, effortless comfort of being together. She took the seat he pulled out for her, biting back a smile as he poured them each a glass of water, straight from the same kind of cooler she used to sell from. It was silly, it was ridiculous, and it was so very Lucas. They ate in comfortable silence, sharing small smiles, soft laughter, the occasional brush of hands that sent little jolts of electricity through her veins. And then, as the city hummed around them, as the streetlights flickered overhead, as the moment stretched between them like something sacred, Lucas stood, and suddenly, she knew. Her breath caught in her throat as he took a step back, reaching into his pocket, his fingers curling around something. His blue eyes held hers, steady and unwavering, and then, with deliberate slowness, he knelt. Sophia's hands flew to her mouth. The world tilted. Her pulse pounded so hard she thought she might break. But Lucas? Lucas was calm, sure, like he had always known they would end up here. His voice was steady when he spoke. Sophia Carter. Her breath hitched. The first time I met you, I didn't know what hit me. I thought I was just buying a bottle of water from a girl on the street. His lips quirked. But you weren't just a girl. You were you. And from the moment you stood your ground, from the moment you challenged me, from the moment you made me see the world differently, I knew. Sophia's chest ached. Lucas's fingers tightened around the small velvet box in his hand. I knew you were going to change my life. A tear slipped down her cheek. And you have, he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. You've taught me that money doesn't mean happiness. That power isn't everything. That the greatest success isn't found in boardrooms or skyscrapers. It's found in the quiet, ordinary moments. The moments I get to spend with you. Her throat tightened, the tears falling freely now. Lucas swallowed hard. I love you, Sophia. I love every stubborn, beautiful, brilliant part of you. And I don't want to spend another second of my life without you. Then slowly he opened the box. Inside was the simplest, most breathtaking ring she had ever seen. A delicate band, a single stone, nothing flashy, nothing over the top. It was perfect. It was her. Lucas took a slow breath, his voice barely above a whisper now. So, Sophia Carter, will you marry me? Her world stopped. Everything around her, the city, the distant honking of cars, the murmurs of pedestrians passing by, blurred into nothing. All that mattered was him, this man who had fought for her, who had chosen her, who had waited for her to be ready. And now, staring down at him, her heart knew. She had spent so much time believing that love meant sacrifice, that choosing someone meant losing herself. But with Lucas, with him, love had never been a cage, it had been freedom. A shaky laugh escaped her lips. You idiot. Lucas arched an eyebrow. Is that a yes? Sophia let out a choked sob, nodding furiously as she dropped to her knees, throwing her arms around him. Yes, she whispered against his neck. A million times, yes. A sound rumbled in his chest, a soft, relieved laugh, and then suddenly his lips were on hers, and nothing else in the world mattered. Not the past, not the fears, not the whispered doubts that had once held her back. Only this, only them. Forever. Sophia Carter never dreamed of a grand wedding. She never imagined herself standing in a cathedral adorned with golden chandeliers, walking down an aisle lined with silk, surrounded by hundreds of guests dressed in designer gowns and tailored suits. She had never cared for the idea of excess, of luxury, of proving something to the world with a ceremony that felt more like a spectacle than a celebration. All she had ever wanted, all she had ever needed, was love. And today, as she stood in front of the man who had changed her world, who had waited for her, who had fought for her in ways she never thought anyone would. She realized she had everything. The ceremony was small, intimate, perfect. It wasn't held in a grand ballroom or an extravagant venue. Instead, it took place in the garden behind Lucas's family estate, a quiet, private space filled with warm sunlight in the gentle rustling of trees. There were no massive floral arrangements, no towering wedding cakes, no hired orchestras playing music that neither of them cared about. Just a handful of their closest friends. Just them. And that was all that mattered. Sophia stood at the edge of the garden, her heart hammering against her ribs. She took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she smoothed down the soft fabric of her dress. It wasn't extravagant. It wasn't something designed by a famous name, something worth thousands of dollars. It was simple, delicate, a white lace gown that hugged her in all the right places, flowing down in soft waves around her legs. She had found it in a tiny boutique, tucked away between two coffee shops in the city. The moment she had put it on, she had known. Just like she had known Lucas was the one. A warm breeze brushed against her skin, carrying the sound of quiet laughter from their friends waiting just a few feet away. And then she looked up and saw him, her breath caught in her throat. Lucas stood at the end of the aisle, dressed in a crisp white shirt with the sleeves rolled up just enough to show his forearms, his black slacks tailored perfectly. He wasn't wearing a tie. He didn't need to. Because somehow, even in his simplest form, he looked unbelievably, devastatingly perfect. And the way he was looking at her, like she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, sent warmth rushing through every inch of her. Sophia swallowed hard, blinking rapidly against the burn of tears in her eyes. This was real. This was happening. She took her first step forward, and suddenly she wasn't scared anymore. With every step she took toward him, memories flashed through her mind like a film reel. The first time she had met him on the street, stubborn and unshaken. The way he had challenged her, intrigued her, made her see the world in a way she never had before. The fights, the laughter, the moments in between when he would look at her like she was something precious, something he never wanted to lose. The night she had walked away, the moment she had come back, and now this. The culmination of every battle, every doubt, every choice that had led them here. She reached him, her hands shaking slightly as she took his. Lucas's fingers tightened around hers, grounding her, steadying her, his thumb brushing over the pulse at her wrist. A silent, "I'm here." A silent, "I always will be." And as she stared up into those deep blue eyes that had once terrified her, because they saw too much, because they made her feel too much, she felt nothing but peace. The officiant spoke, but Sophia barely heard the words. She was too caught up in the way Lucas was watching her. Like this moment meant as much to him as it did to her. Like this wasn't just a wedding, it was a promise. And when it was time for their vows, her throat tightened. Because how was she supposed to put into words what this man had come to mean to her? How was she supposed to tell him that she had spent so long afraid of love, only to find freedom in him? She took a shaky breath, tightening her grip on his hands. Then with every ounce of courage in her body, she spoke. "I didn't believe in love," she admitted, her voice breaking. Lucas's eyes softened. "I didn't believe in needing someone. I didn't believe in letting someone carry my burdens. I didn't believe that love could be something strong instead of something that trapped you." Her lips trembled as a tear slipped down her cheek. "And then I met you." Lucas exhaled sharply as if those words hit something inside him. "You didn't try to change me. You didn't try to fix me. You just showed up again and again. And somewhere along the way, I stopped being afraid." She swallowed hard, because love was never supposed to make me weaker. It was supposed to make me stronger. "And Lucas, you are my strength." His jaw clenched. His fingers squeezed hers just a little tighter. "So I don't care about rings. I don't care about ceremonies or traditions or anything else." A small, choked laugh escaped her lips. "I just care about you, about us. And as long as I have you, I have everything." Lucas let out a shaky breath. His turn. "Sophia." His voice was raw, heavy with emotion. "The first time I saw you, I thought you were going to be just another moment in my life." His lips twitched. "I had no idea you were going to become my entire future." Sophia felt her breath stutter. I don't care about money. I don't care about status. I don't care about the world I came from, because none of it ever meant a damn thing until I met you. He took a slow breath, his fingers brushing along her knuckles. You are the bravest, strongest, most infuriatingly stubborn woman I have ever met. A soft laugh rippled through the small crowd, but Lucas didn't smile. His eyes burned with truth. And I love you in a way I didn't know was possible. I love you in a way that isn't temporary or fleeting. I love you in a way that is permanent, forever. Sophia let out a quiet sob. Because this was everything. The officiant smiled. Lucas, do you take Sophia to be your wife? Lucas didn't hesitate. I do. The officiant turned to her. Sophia, do you take Lucas to be your husband? Tears spilled freely down her face as she whispered, I do. And then, before anyone could even announce it, before they could even finish the ceremony, Lucas was pulling her in and kissing her like his life depended on it. The small crowd erupted in cheers, but all Sophia knew was him, his arms wrapped tightly around her. His lips pressed against hers in a kiss that was full of laughter, of relief, of home. And for the first time in her life, Sophia Carter didn't feel like she was running. She felt like she had arrived. Sophia Carter never believed in fairy tales. She never imagined a happily ever after. Never thought love could be something lasting. Life had taught her that nothing was permanent, that people left, that even the strongest bonds could break. But now, as she stood in the doorway of their small but beautiful home, watching Lucas Hayes, her husband, move around the kitchen in a t-shirt and sweatpants, attempting and failing to make breakfast, she realized something. She hadn't just found love, she had found home. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of losing it. Because this was forever. The wedding had been perfect, not because of the flowers or the venue or the food, though everything had been exactly how she wanted it, but because at the end of that day, she had walked away with him. And now their life together had truly begun. It wasn't grand, it wasn't extravagant, it was theirs. Mornings filled with the smell of coffee and burnt toast because Lucas insisted on cooking, even though he was terrible at it. Afternoons spent side by side working, her with her growing business, him with his empire, but always finding moments to pause, to be together, to remind each other why they had fought so hard for this love. Evenings curled up on the couch, her head resting against his chest, his fingers running lazily through her hair, the sound of the city outside their window, but the only thing that mattered was the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that was enough. One evening, as they sat on their tiny balcony, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance, Sophia turned to him. You ever think about what would have happened if we never met? She asked softly. Lucas didn't hesitate. No, she laughed. Why not? He shifted, wrapping an arm around her, pulling her closer. Because it was always going to be you and me. Her chest tightened. She had spent so much time believing that love was uncertain, that it could disappear in an instant. But Lucas had never wavered, and now neither would she. As the months passed, their life grew. Sophia finally opened her own business, a small cafe, one that served real food, the kind Lucas used to tease her about loving. It was warm, welcoming, a place where people could feel at home. Lucas was proud of her, and every time he walked in, sat at the counter, and ordered a coffee just to see her smile, she realized something. She had always been strong. She had always been independent, but that didn't mean she had to do everything alone, because love wasn't about losing yourself. It was about choosing someone to stand beside you. Through the good, through the bad, through everything. And now, as she looked at Lucas, her husband, her best friend, the man who had never given up on her, she knew. She had won, not because she had found success, not because she had built something on her own, but because she had let love in. Because she had stopped running. And because she had realized that sometimes the greatest strength wasn't in pushing people away, it was in learning to hold on. What do you think? Do you believe in love that stands the test of time? Let us know in the comments. If you love this story and want more emotional, heartfelt stories like this, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more beautiful, touching stories. Turn on notifications so you never miss a new story that will warm your heart and remind you that love, real love, is always worth fighting for.